People's Dispatch was saying that OPEC just laid a body blow to the Biden presidency. Okay, so this was written yesterday as well, or released yesterday. It says OPEC Plus decision is poised to benefit Russia in multiple ways. It will buoy Russia's oil revenue heading into winter when demand for Russian energy from Europe typically rises. So I'm going to read this briefly before, and then we're going to move on to the next story. So the Biden administration is swiftly establishing a narrative that the recent OPEC decision to cut oil production by 2 million tons is geopolitical aligning by Saudi Arabia to Russia. It taps into Russophobia in the Beltway and deflects attention from the humiliating defeat of President Biden's personal diplomacy with Saudi Arabia, but it is not without basis either. Foreign policy was reputed to be Biden's forte, but is turning out to be his nemesis. An ignominious end is not unlikely, as with Jimmy Carter. West Asia may become the burial ground of his carefully cultivated reputation. The magnitude of what is unfolding is simply staggering. Biden realizes belatedly that territorial conquest in Ukraine is not the real story, but embedded in it is the economic war, and within it is the energy war that has been incubating over the past 8-month period following Western sanctions on Russia. The paradox is, even if Zelensky wins the war, Biden would still have lost the war unless he wins the energy war and goes on to win the economic war as well. Now, that's not happening. The United States is not winning any of these wars. Zelensky is not going to win the war against Russia, the proxy war on Russia. The United States isn't going to win an economic war against Russia. If it were, it would have already happened by now. Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world, but its currency continues to become more valuable on the world market. And if it wasn't for the Nord Stream destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, the terrorist attack on it, it probably would be posting even if not economic growth, positive economic growth. Now it's a little bit negative, but that's no problem for Russia, given the overall situation is going to be global recession. So Vladimir Putin realized such an outcome as far back, or visualized this outcome as far back as 2016, when on the sidelines of the G20 Hangzhou summit, the tantalizing idea of OPEC Plus crystallized between him and then Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I wrote at the time that, quote, an understanding between Russia and OPEC holds the potential of completely transforming geopolitical alignments in the Middle East. This shift cannot but impact petrodollar recycling, which has been historically a robust pillar of the Western financial system. In strategic terms, too, Washington's attempt to isolate Russia have been rendered ineffective, and that was 6 years ago. So the debris that surrounds Biden today is a messy pile. He didn't realize that the lackadaisical way that the Russian offensive in Ukraine rolled on, because Putin was concentrating on the economic war and the energy war, the outcome of which will determine the future of the U.S. as a global hegemony, which has been riveted on the dollar being the reserve currency. Back in the early 1970s, Saudi Arabia agreed that the price of oil should be determined in dollars and that oil, the world's most widely traded commodity, would be internationally traded in dollars, which virtually mandated that every country on the planet ought to hold dollar reserves in order to buy oil. The U.S., of course, reciprocally pledged on its part to free access to the dollar was guaranteed for all countries. However, it turned out to be a phony assurance in the wake of the rampant weaponization of the dollar and the U.S.'s preposterous moves to grab other countries' dollar reserves. Unsurprisingly, Putin has been harping on the need for setting up a reserve currency alternative to the dollar, and that finds resonance in world opinion. All indications are that the White House, instead of introspection, is considering new forms of punishment for Saudi Arabia and Russia. While punishing Russia is difficult, since the U.S. has exhausted all of its options, Biden thinks he still holds Saudi Arabia by jugular veins, being supplier of weaponry and custodian of massive Saudi reserves and investments, and being the mentor of Saudi elites. So Brian Deese, the director of the National Economic Council, told reporters on Thursday, quote, I want to be clear, this OPEC production cut, the president has directed that we have all options on the table and will look to continue, and that will continue to be the case. Early on Thursday, Biden told reporters he is looking at alternatives. So this is going to be interesting because it's going to be interesting to see whether Biden can punish Saudi Arabia over this. I think not. But it'll be interesting to see if that's actually possible. Does the United States think it can bite this ally, that it can continue to try to put into the trash bin the economies of its allies? It's already did it to Europe. Does it think it can afford to do that to Saudi Arabia? I mean, the United States is trying to take a wrecking ball to the entire world and now is doing so more egregiously toward allies. Does this look like an empire that's rising or an empire in decline? Because to me, this behavior is so desperate. Saudi Arabia is one of the US's most loyal allies on very important issues, very important. But the world situation has become so intense. The contradictions have sharpened so much that even Saudi Arabia has to think twice about this US policy toward Russia, because Russia is a reliable friend. The United States, well, you don't do one thing the United States says, and now they're considering trying to basically chop your legs off, right? Pull the rug out from under you. Does that sound like an empire with strength or one that's declining? To me, it sounds like one that's declining. So neither Biden nor Deese explicitly named what those alternatives would be, other than to reiterate their ability to pull from strategic petroleum reserves, lean on energy companies to reduce consumer prices, and work with Congress to consider legislative options. This is a foreign policy black eye for Biden, who is facing ridicule over his Saudi Arabia trip in July, which is excoriated by Democrats and Republicans alike. The U.S. political elite feels that the OPEC decision looks like a targeted Saudi move to weaken Biden and the Democrats in advance of the November elections. And of course, all the liberals are saying, Russian agents, this is a Russian plot. This is all about, I mean, everything's a Russian plot, right? Elon Musk talking about peace, Tulsi Gabbard, which if we have time, we'll get to. But everything's a Russian plot, right? So now Saudi Arabia is working with the Russians. It's a foreign policy move with the Russians. It absolutely isn't. This is Saudi Arabia's just assertion of even a nominal form of sovereignty. Just saying, we're not going to do what you say here because what you're saying for us to do here is actually going to be against our economic interests in the short term. Saudi Arabia is thinking short term right now as well, while it's working long term with its growing partnerships in Asia, with Russia, with China, with the entire Asian continent, west, all the way from west to east, north to south. So potentially this could have an impact beyond the U.S.-Saudi relationship, right? And could change the security picture in West Asia more than anything since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Already, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has slouched toward West Asia, with Iran joining it, and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Egypt being granted status as dialogue partners, and Turkey intending to seek full membership. In the broader terms of de-dollarization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand drew up a roadmap for a gradual increase in the share of national currencies and mutual settlements, flagging the seriousness of its intention. Now, the American defense industry will stiffly resist any attempts to unwind business in Saudi Arabia. It has extremely close ties to the Biden administration. But Washington may work for some sort of regime change in Riyadh. Prince Salman said he does not care if Biden misunderstands him. There's little affection between them. The point is, this is not a mere hiccup. So then they're going to talk about, could a color revolution happen in Saudi Arabia? Maybe so. It's a little risky. It could turn to chaos. We don't have to go into this whole thing. The point is, though, is that there's a price cap now that the EU has placed, that the United States is leading on Russian energy. This energy crisis is worsening. The cost of energy, which was down, as this article said, or maybe it was at the prior, there was a low point in energy. It was going down slightly and steadily in August, and now it's going up again. And Saudi Arabia doesn't want it to lower. And neither does Russia, given all of these sanctions and the economic instability. And of course, the United States kind of shot itself in its own foot by emphasizing these interest rate hikes in order to try to install investment as a whole, basically to facilitate an economic recession in order to pull through its own contradictions. Absolutely, an incredible turn of events, and Saudi Arabia is kind of sick of it. And this is Saudi Arabia. This is not a country that's typically standing up to the United States. So The ironic thing here is Moscow, Russia, won't have to reduce a single barrel of output as it is already producing well below its OPEC target, and it's benefiting from the higher oil price, which will be achieved through cuts mainly by OPEC Gulf producers, shouldered by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, UAE, and Kuwait. So, isn't it amazing, they say, that Russian oil companies will benefit from higher prices while at the same time keeping output steady? This is when the central bank in Russia is likely to have more than recovered $300 billion of reserves already that were frozen by Western central banks at the beginning of the Ukraine war. In reality, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states involved with OPEC Plus have effectively sided with Russia, enabling Russia to refill its coffers and limit the impact of Western sanctions. The implications are far-reaching, from the Ukraine war to the future relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and the emergent multipolar world order. So, I think that was a solid article by People's Dispatch. Now, I don't necessarily think it means, I kind of disagree with this idea that it means that Saudi Arabia is siding with Russia, because I think one of the things about multipolarity that's very interesting is that it's not really about these poles. Saudi Arabia is really thinking about its own interests, cutting production and keeping prices high, keep profits flowing. By flooding the market with more oil and reducing the price, it only increases competition. It only ensures that U.S. and big Western countries and corporations will benefit from that through a restabilization. But it doesn't change the overall dynamic that Saudi Arabia is looking at, which is there's a recession on the way, if not already here. And the U.S.'s policy, the EU's policy, NATO's policy toward Russia is not in its long-term, medium-term, or even short-term best interest. So this is big, and it's something that we're going to have to continue to watch out for, right? It's something that I think is going to send shockwaves. It's going to change the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and it's going to, I think, point to more instability for the United States in terms of its foreign policy. This grip that it had, this hegemony that it had, its ability to dictate world affairs is eroding, and that is what this is signaling. And of course, it's going to hurt workers, it's going to hurt oppressed people, because the United States doesn't want to do what is necessary, which is peace, right? Forget all of this pumping Ukraine with military weaponry that's not going to get to them anyway for a long, long time. Forget these sanctions. Let there be a negotiated settlement. Let things stabilize. The United States doesn't want to do it. And Saudi Arabia now has said, well, what can we do but to look out for us, right? And if that means that our decision is going to help Russia, well, at least Russia's a good friend,